What's happening to American democracy? With a billionaire demagogue on the right, a self-declared socialist on the left, and disenchanted voters turning their backs on the political establishment, the nomination for this year's presidential poll has become the most polarized in decades. In this second of a two-part special report, Bob Abeshouse examines the deep divisions over social and demographic change which are fueling America's move to the political margins.
The 2016 presidential election in the United States is raising fundamental questions about the state of its democracy.
We're going to do a lot of trips over the next month, but I think we're going to have a great victory. And I think more importantly than anything else, this country is going to start winning again. We don't win anymore.
The Republican frontrunner, right-wing populist Donald Trump, has tapped into a deep distrust of politics as usual and the economic anxieties of a shrinking middle class. So has Democratic socialist Bernie Sanders.
Workers today are working longer hours for lower wages. They're worried about the future of their kids.
Hillary Clinton is the likely Democratic nominee, but Sanders continues to pull in millions of votes. The appeal of anti-establishment candidates also points to deep divisions in the electorate over social and demographic change. A war is being fought against a new emerging majority. It is polarizing America and weakening its democratic institutions.
Right now there is a cultural war, a battle over American values, driven by the counter-revolution of the Republican Party against this new majority. Bill Clinton was the formative one, and which I was part of that process.
Stanley Greenberg has worked on 3 Democratic presidential campaigns. In his recent book, America Ascendant, he discusses the revolution in American life arising from a changing electorate and the counter-revolution being waged by Republicans.
America is changing, dramatically changing. If you look at the growing parts of the electorate, you focus in on racial minorities, unmarried women, millennials, seculars, people with no religion. In the 2016 electorate, they'll be 63%.
Greenberg argues the 2004 election, which George Bush barely won, unleashed damaging forces on American democracy.
Karl Rove was the manager of the George Bush campaign, and he concluded that there were 5 million evangelicals who would be brought in to vote if conservatives were focusing on energizing their base. And his theory was you have to create this sense of Armageddon, that if we don't stop this new majority from governing, they will destroy our values. Our way of life is at stake. And that intensified from that decade on. And that's where you've seen the increasing polarization of the country. And that's what we're watching today as we look at this pretty ugly scene taking place in America.
That's very damaging in terms of the fabric of American democracy, no?
For sure. To be honest, it was a strategy that rooted the Republican Party in the most rural, most racially conscious, and religiously observant parts of the country. It enabled them to compete because they've been able to get their voters to vote in larger numbers, obviously buttressed by a great deal of corporate money and billionaire money, to fund it. Also, you've seen the efforts to deny voting rights in states that are in the Republican base of the country.
One of the places where that's happening is in Alabama, where the biggest battle over African American voting rights was waged 51 years ago on this bridge in Selma.
The days wherein you look at where you had been and where you wanted to go, and then proceeding with a determination that whatever it cost, that we were going to move forward, that all people, regardless of skin color, should have the right to participate in the political process.
On Bloody Sunday, March 7, 1965, Frederick D. Reese and more than 600 activists seeking the vote for African Americans crossed the bridge on their way to Montgomery, the state capital. They were viciously attacked by state and local law enforcement officers. But 2 weeks later, Martin Luther King, who Reese had asked to come to Selma, marched with thousands to Montgomery under the protection of federal troops. The march from Selma led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in August 1965, bringing millions of African Americans into the political process.
There's a feeling of great triumph and victory.
But since 2010, 21 Republican-controlled states have passed new voting laws. And the U.S. Supreme Court, headed by conservative Justice John Roberts, threw out a key provision of the Voting Rights Act in the 2013 Shelby County versus Holder case.
American democracy has taken a huge step backward in recent years.
Harry Berman is the author of a recent book on the Voting Rights Act and a writer for The Nation magazine.
What kind of restrictive voting measures have been passed across the country?
These are things like shutting down voter registration drives and requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote, cutting back on early voting, the amount of time you have to vote before Election Day, both the number of days and the hours, requiring strict forms of ID to cast a ballot that you've never needed in any previous election.
Who's most affected by these restrictive measures?
They target Democratic-leaning voters, so young voters, lower-income voters, and voters of color are disproportionately hit by these new restrictions.
As a result of the Supreme Court decision, states with a history of discrimination no longer need to submit voting law changes to the Justice Department for approval. Within 24 hours of the decision, Alabama and 4 other southern states rushed to put new voter ID laws in place.
They implemented a voter ID law. They knew would disenfranchise a lot of poor people and a lot of older people.
Katrina Norris Carter is the coordinator of the annual Selma Bridge Crossing Jubilee.
What's different about the voter ID law compared to how people could vote in the past?
In the past, it'd have your Social Security card, power bill, just something that showed you were a resident of Alabama.
Republicans argue that a voter ID is needed to combat fraudulent voting. But a study found that a person is more likely to be struck by lightning than impersonate another voter.
This is one of the driver's license divisions that's being closed.
The easiest form of photo ID to obtain is a driver's license at a motor vehicle department office. But last September, Alabama's Republican governor and legislature closed all the offices in areas where more than 75% of the voters are African American. Carter and other community leaders demonstrated at all the closed offices.
It's sad that we are being legislated back into the 60s. Yes.
Alabama Republicans say anyone who needs a picture ID to vote can get it for free from the county registrar.
That's difficult if you work 10 hours a day. That's difficult for a person that's in a nursing home. If you're in rural areas, transportation can be a problem.
The governor says these offices are being closed because of money.
We're talking about $100,000 total for the entire state. I think it's pure and simple, it's voter suppression.
Our requests for an interview with Alabama Governor Bentley were ignored, but we caught up with him at a National Governors Association meeting.
Excuse me, Mr. Bentley, can you tell me why you decided you needed the voter ID law?
Governor, you've got the governor's only session. We've got to go.
I do.
I just have 3 questions, sir.
Well, and I appreciate that, but you need to schedule something with us.
I tried.
Okay, we'll talk to her right there. She's in charge of that. Yes, sir.
I did 3 times. Isn't it really an issue of trying to help Republicans win?
If you wanted to make it harder for people to vote, you would do exactly what Alabama did. It's not just that you're preventing people from voting, it's that you make voting so inconvenient that people choose not to do it. And that's what we're seeing, unfortunately, in a bunch of different places.
This is like the typical New York Times headline, "World Ends, Minorities and Women Hit Hardest." I mean, it's just a non-issue.
Ilya Shapiro is a senior fellow at the Libertarian Cato Institute in Washington. The institute is funded by the billionaire Koch brothers and other wealthy conservatives. Shapiro submitted a brief in the Shelby County case arguing that the provision of the Voting Rights Act requiring southern states to pre-clear new voting laws was no longer needed.
The coverage formula, that is, which jurisdictions are covered, that hadn't changed since the late 60s, early 70s. And the Supreme Court ultimately said, easily, correctly, that that can't be the case.
I mean, I was in Alabama. They passed a voter ID law, and then they closed the motor vehicle offices in all of the counties that have African American registration above 70%. I mean, what do you think's going on there?
Alabama has a terrible public relations operation. What it did was, for budget reasons that a lot of states are doing.
Do you know how much Alabama has saved by closing the motor vehicle offices?
Not offhand.
$100,000. That's what they saved.
It's understandable why the Democratic Party would try to make an issue out of this, but ultimately it doesn't affect our democracy. one way or another. It's not that it helps against voter fraud. The voter ID, by the way, is a red herring on both sides.
Why do you think it's a red herring?
Because nobody's disenfranchised and there's not that much.
There's been a number of studies that show that it's reduced turnout.
This is only an issue for elites that inside Washington that debate this back and forth.
I would suppose that the major funders of the Cato Institute, like the Caucus, and I would suspect you feel that a Republican form of government with a small r is a better form of government than a democracy with a small d.
Absolutely. And you know who agrees with us? The founders. My highest ideal is protecting individual liberty, not protecting empowering democracy.
All across the country, not just in traditional southern states like Alabama and Mississippi, but in key swing states like North Carolina and Wisconsin and Ohio, voters are going to go to the polls and face new restrictions. So you're talking about a very large number of voters, definitely large enough to swing a close election.
In addition to passing new voting laws, Republicans in several key states have redrawn the boundaries of congressional districts to dilute the impact of minority voters. Texas is one of them.
I see this as a racial fight. The political strength and will of the minority community is going to be suppressed in order for the white establishment to maintain control of all the institutions of power in the state of Texas.
Attorney Jose Garza represents Latino legislators in a case against Republicans for the way they reshaped electoral districts, what's known as gerrymandering. As a result of population growth recorded in the 2010 census, Texas was allocated 4 new congressional seats.
75% alone of that explosion of that population growth was Hispanic. So going into the redistricting, we were getting 4 new seats. The Latino community felt, we're going to get at least 2 of those districts. With gerrymandering, we ended up with a 0 net gain.
In 2012, Democratic congressional candidates got more than 1 million more votes than Republicans. But because of gerrymandering around the country, the Republicans maintained a strong House majority.
It's something that both parties do, but because Republicans control so many states now, they've been more aggressive about doing it. And so we have a Congress that is not reflective of the country that it's supposed to represent. The Congress is more white, it's more rural, and it's more male than the country as a whole.
Republicans assured themselves a seat in Texas' 27th congressional district, which includes Corpus Christi and all of Nueces County.
So Nueces County at Corpus Christi used to be part of a district that went all the way to the border.
Right.
And then what happened?
So there was enough Mexican-American population so that you could create an additional Latino district, or you could splinter the Latino population, and that's what they did. Almost 300,000 people in Nueces County. 60% of them are Hispanic. They are now in an Anglo-controlled district in which they have no voice in the choice of their congressman.
Latinos in Corpus Christi are now represented in Congress by a conservative Tea Party Republican, Blake Farenthold.
Running a good campaign or a hard campaign will only take you so far when the numbers just simply aren't there.
Solomon Ortiz Jr. had aspirations of running for Congress in his father's old district until the 200,000 Latinos in Corpus Christi were moved into a district with a Republican majority.
When I was in Congress, Republican and Democrat, we would get together to put a Texan on every committee so that we would know what was happening. That has all changed. Now you don't see members talking together. It's more of a power play than representation.
The governor here has said Texas is the last line of defense in presidential politics against the Democrats. What do you think he meant?
The Republican messaging is very good at having this alarmist message, oh my goodness, like we're being overrun, we're going to be taken over by the Mexicans. And that type of rhetoric, that type of alarmist attitude works.
If you believe that your values are going to be undermined, that we face Armageddon, then you can justify these actions to keep this new majority from governing, and that requires ever more intensity, ever more emotion to keep your people engaged so you have a chance of winning.
Help us, Lord God, not to follow the path of the Roman Empire, which exploded, deteriorated, and fell.
The Republican message of Armageddon also resonates in Terre Haute, Indiana. The city's citizens have achieved a bit of fame for always picking the presidential winner. Dan Willis is the pastor of the Holman Street Wesleyan Church.
The Roman Empire collapsed due to economic failure based on moral decline. And I believe that there's a very strong possibility that we could walk in the same footsteps.
Of course, there's a lot of cultural changes, right? In terms of same-sex marriage, in
Right.
terms of abortion.
Right. I personally think that only God can take a life. I also believe there's a certain standard of things that God has set into place. Either you're going to believe in God or you aren't.
So what do you think of the election this time around?
I think Trump is incredibly interesting. He's saying things a lot of people have perhaps thought but not said. And then maybe some things he said are a little offensive to people. But I don't think that Trump is going to really do anything, that I believe is morally wrong against my belief system.
A surprise to many is how well Trump is doing with evangelicals, who are supposed to be a strength of his main opponent, Ted Cruz. When conservative Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia died in February, the need to fill his seat gave Cruz an opening to stir up the evangelical vote.
If we get this wrong, if we nominate the wrong candidate, the Second Amendment, life, marriage, religious liberty, every one of those hangs in the balance.
President Obama nominated a replacement, but Senate Republicans see electoral benefit in preventing a Democratic appointment and say they won't even consider it until after the November election.
The Supreme Court nomination is going to be wrapped up in the presidential election. You think that's going to be healthy for the polity?
I think that's a very healthy thing. It crystallizes this issue for voters.
That's going to heighten polarization in America.
Well, polarization by itself isn't necessarily bad.
It makes it a lot harder to get things done, doesn't it?
Sure, but again, getting things done is not the primary goal of our constitutional system.
It is if the middle class is shrinking. People are angry, and they're supporting people like Trump and Sanders because Congress isn't doing anything.
I don't think the complaint of Trump voters is that Congress isn't passing laws. I think you can't simply say it's bad governance if nothing gets passed. If the options are bad laws versus no laws, well, you'd want no laws.
The Tea Party and Freedom Caucuses, far-right Republicans in Congress, also prefer polarization to compromise on their free market principles. They have brought down a House Speaker and tied the Congress in knots, supported by the billionaire Koch brothers and other wealthy conservatives.
The Kochs have essentially built a privatized political party that in some ways surpasses the capabilities of the Republican National Committee and all of its arms. It's totally unprecedented. Political parties have to show that they are willing to come to the table to compromise in the best interest of the government and of the people. These billionaires and multimillionaires don't have that, and many times they would prefer to pick a principled fight that may shut down the government.
Institutional gridlock is also a central strategy of those waging the culture war.
Polarization is fine. If people think government fails and can't address problems, that's fine. You're willing to do that because what you're stopping is this new majority from governing in its name.
36% of Republicans tell us they think the Democratic Party is a threat to the well-being of the nation. 27% of Democrats say the same thing about the Republican Party. That sense of distance makes it hard for political leaders to reach out towards the center.
Dimmick says political polarization is reinforced by where people prefer to live, urban or rural areas, the media they listen to, and ever more sophisticated campaign technology.
Almost all of us have at least one issue that we're passionate about. And the more campaigns can find the ways to engage us, it pulls our thinking around into a more polarized world.
Aristotle is a complete suite of technology for influencing decisions at the ballot box.
John Phillips is the CEO of Aristotle Industries, a pioneer in voter targeting technology.
This is an example of the way in which the demographics can be targeted for certain groups of voters. And here's a map, for instance, of the electorate. And you can zoom in and take a look at different aspects of the voters that you're seeking to target.
Each of these yellow things represent a singular voter at each house. The closer that we
Drew Doherty is a top targeting analyst at the company.
Each of these push pins represents a voter that the campaign wants to target based on all the different data here.
Yes. The data comes from a myriad of different sources, such as who subscribed to a certain magazine subscription. Also, how many cars do you own? What make and model of cars? But once you go ahead and layer thousands upon thousands of data points that we have available, we start to get a better picture of what the makeup of the household is.
Does that also determine what type of messages go to different people?
It absolutely can, yes. We also have what we call micro-targeted universes.
So here you have Second Amendment supporters, gun rights, I guess.
Second Amendment, active military, healthcare professionals. We even have likely Hillary Clinton supporters.
Likely Tea Party donors.
Likely Tea Party donors. We have about 2,500 data points on every single voter in the United States. Information from Facebook, from Twitter. We're able to go ahead and deliver a 30-second ad on the computer now to a specific voter.
I see. So in the digital age, you can send a digital ad to the people that you digitally targeted.
Absolutely, yes.
In a fractured society such as ours, people retreat into very particular interests and very particular identities. And that fracturing of the society makes it far easier to control.
Chris Hedges, a leading socialist critic of neoliberalism, is a best-selling author and journalist. He believes America today is a managed democracy, a term coined by the late philosopher Sheldon Wolin.
By managed democracy, he means that it's choreographed. It's political theater. That's why they spend so much money on it. It's a way of corralling people into a system that mocks the whole concept of the consent of the governed.
Totalitarianism is a strong word. Why did Wolin think it applied to America's political system today?
He describes the system we live under as inverted totalitarianism, which sees the rise of unchecked, unlimited corporate power that doesn't define itself by a particular ideology other than the primacy of profit and the virtues of capitalism. It purports to pay fealty to electoral politics, and yet has seized all of the levers of power to render the citizen impotent.
Mr. Trump embodies
Issues are almost never discussed in any real way. They amplify the banal, the ridiculous, the trivial. Every news broadcast on the elections is like a day at the races.
But if you look at the race right now, yes, Ted Cruz can claim his home state.
Didn't the president of CBS tell investors late last year that Trump was good for earnings?
Well, yeah, of course. Because it's all about ratings. It's all about raising money from advertising and entertainment. And you'll get them all three.
Where do you think America's political system is heading?
Sometimes these decaying systems have far more resiliency than you expect, but that something is coming, I think is undeniable. And then the country, I fear, will devolve into a kind of naked authoritarianism. But, I think we have a moral responsibility to do everything we can to reinstate democracy and to save the country.
You might always anticipate certain restrictions that will come up when you move forward, and then there were those who want to make sure that you will regress instead of progress. And therefore, those of us who have determination to fight should move forward, regardless of the consequences.
In fact, there are disturbing signs that Trump's campaign to make America great again is unleashing intolerance and violence.
You see somebody getting ready to throw a tomato? Knock the crap out of them, would you? Seriously.
Republican leaders and many in the Koch network now fear that a Trump run for president against the Democratic frontrunner Hillary Clinton could be a disaster for the party and its congressional candidates.
He stands for nothing in particular ideologically. He's much more of a Mussolini or someone like that, in terms of he stands for himself and power for its own being.
Super PACs funded by wealthy conservatives are targeting Trump with tens of millions of dollars in ads. The aim is to prevent him from winning the delegates he needs to lock up the nomination during the primary season. The stage is set for a raucous Republican convention in July.
This will be a shattering election for the Republican Party. Trump is extreme as can be, and he's a threat to democracy, of course, if he were to be elected. But the opposite will happen here. This is because we have a growing, diverse country, more tolerant country, beyond the tipping point with the new majority, which is growing at a huge pace.
So you think American democracy will renew itself?
I do. I think that as mad as this is, as corrupt as this is, as undemocratic as it is, I think the shattering result that I think is coming to the Republicans, given where they've gone, and the pressure for Democrats to lead an era of reform, I think is healthy on both sides. But the Democrats have to rise to the occasion. When this election's over, will they take up the mantle of reform? I think it really does depend on the public and social movements and pressure building in civil society in order for that to happen.